And so we arrive at the final, most unsettling layer of this story. It would be comforting to think of this family as an artifact, a fragment of history best left in the past, but the truth refuses to bend to comfort. They are still here, they are still having children, and their story, though rarely told, is written into the soil of America itself. A story that began in isolation, fed on silence, and grew into something that now stands as living testimony to what happens when bloodlines collapse inward, generation after generation. When we look into their faces, we are not only seeing the outcome of inbreeding, we are seeing the reflection of neglect, the price of a society that chose not to intervene, the burden of a people abandoned to their own survival. These are not monsters, though their appearances have been called monstrous. They are not villains, though their choices defied the rules of nature itself. They are human beings, trapped within the narrow confines of their ancestry, carrying forward the weight of decisions made long before they were born. And perhaps that is what makes this story so difficult to face. Horror is easy when it belongs to fiction, when it is written into the pages of a novel or played out on a screen. But here, the horror breathes. It ages, it reproduces, it lingers. To confront it is to confront the possibility that other families, hidden in forgotten valleys or along untraveled roads, may be carrying secrets just as dark, just as heavy, just as haunting. The family's existence forces us to wrestle with questions most would rather leave unanswered. How much of identity is chosen and how much is inherited? When a bloodline collapses into itself, does it remain a family, or does it become something else entirely? And when the world outside knows and still turns away, who bears the greater sin? As we close this chapter, remember this is, you were never meant to hear this story. You were never meant to see their faces, to learn their names, to feel the weight of their legacy. And yet, now you know. The bloodline continues, the cousins still marry, and the children are still born. A cycle unbroken, a secret too heavy for silence, too disturbing to ignore. The most inbred cousins still breeding today, living proof that some family histories do not end. They echo. The further we peer into this story, the more it resembles a mirror reflecting something many would rather not see, because this family, though extreme, is not alone in history. Across America, hidden in forgotten corners, cousin marriages and insular bloodlines have existed for centuries. But here, the isolation grew so deep, the cycle so unbroken, that the results became impossible to ignore. What we witness is not just the collapse of health, but the collapse of choice itself. Generations born into a trap, repeating what came before because no one showed them another way. Locals who spoke in hushed tones often described the family as strange, but few dared say tragic. Perhaps because tragedy requires empathy, and empathy is difficult when the faces staring back at you remind you of all the rules society tells us should never be broken. To acknowledge their pain would mean acknowledging complicity, that neighbors, towns, even entire counties turned a blind eye for decades. It would mean admitting that this was not simply the product of nature, but of neglect. And yet, when confronted, family members sometimes spoke of their lives with a startling normalcy. To them, this was not monstrous, it was familiar. They spoke of kinship, of bonds, of loyalty stronger than outsiders could understand. In their eyes, the world beyond the valley was the threat, not the family within it. Outsiders judged, mocked, and stared, but inside those walls, they were bound together by a tie they refused to sever: blood. What makes this all the more unsettling is that the cycle still shows no sign of truly ending. Photographs taken in recent decades reveal new generations carrying the same marks. And though outsiders may recoil, those within the family still carry on as though nothing has gone wrong. To them, this is the rhythm of life, and the deformities, the struggles, the whispers, they are burdens they have learned to endure in silence. It forces us to ask, where does responsibility lie? With the family, who continue to close themselves off from the world, or with the society that watched, judged, and did nothing? The answer is uncomfortable because it suggests that perhaps the real horror is not just in the bloodline itself, but in the silence surrounding it. Silence that allowed a tragedy to continue into our own century when it should have been stopped long ago. If you've made it this far, you're already braver than most. Many turn away from stories like this because they force us to face something raw, something we'd rather bury beneath the soil. But here we cannot turn away because the family did not. They kept living, kept marrying, kept bearing children, and in doing so they carried their history forward like a torch no one dared extinguish, and the further they carried it, the darker it burned. By the 1980s and 90s, their story began attracting quiet attention outside the county lines. Rumors traveled, stories of a family so deeply interwoven that children were born unable to speak, some reduced to communicating with grunts or gestures. Journalists would sometimes attempt to follow these rumors, to uncover the truth behind the whispers. Some found only locked gates and hostile stares, others found enough to confirm what locals had always said but never wanted recorded. It was real. It was happening. And it was not ending. When photographs did surface, they told more than words ever could. The faces revealed a lineage heavy with genetic weight, the same features appearing again and again across different generations. Crossed eyes, sloping brows, twisted jaws, physical echoes of marriages that never should have been. And yet, behind those faces were people who smiled, who posed for the camera, who lived their lives as best they could within the limits set long before they were born. That is the part that unsettles most, the reminder that this is not folklore, not legend, but flesh and blood humanity, flawed, broken, and yet undeniably alive. But perhaps the most disturbing truth is this: the family is still here. These are not stories of the past. Children have been born in recent years who carry the same features, the same struggles, the same legacy of a bloodline that folds endlessly inward, and when asked why, the answer is often silence or defiance. For those inside the family, this is not horror, this is life, this is tradition, this is survival in a world that has already turned its back on them. So I ask you, if you found yourself born into such a family, would you have stayed? Would you have broken free? Or would the weight of blood, of loyalty, of silence have chained you too? Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? By the middle of the 20th century, whispers had grown into uneasy acknowledgement. Social workers, teachers, and county officials would sometimes find themselves face to face with members of the family, usually when a child needed help, or when questions arose about schooling. What they saw was not easy to forget. These were children who did not fit neatly into the expectations of the classroom, who struggled not only with learning, but with the basic rhythms of daily life. Some could not form words clearly, their voices warped by physical deformities passed down through bloodlines that never spread outward. Others displayed behaviors that spoke less of defiance and more of an unspoken pain, a confusion about the world outside their walls, a world they were never truly invited into. But it wasn't only officials who bore witness. Passing travelers, journalists chasing stories, even law enforcement on rare occasions, all left behind descriptions that would later read like fragments of a larger puzzle. One would write of faces that seemed hauntingly similar, even among cousins who should not have shared such exact likenesses. Another described long silences, interrupted only by nervous laughter that felt rehearsed, almost childlike, even in adults. And still another would speak of homes with bare furnishings, where family members sat in silence, their eyes shifting to the floor as though ashamed of the very lives they had inherited. Yet despite the pity, despite the unease, the cycle persisted. Cousins continued to marry, continued to bear children, continued to live in the same patch of land where their grandparents and great-grandparents had done the same. The world outside grew louder, busier, more connected. But for this family, the silence of the hills drowned out everything else. It was a silence that became its own kind of prison, locking them in a pattern too strong to break. And here lies the cruelest truth. This was not a secret well guarded by ignorance. People knew, officials knew, neighbors knew, But knowing is not the same as intervening. Fear of ridicule, fear of retaliation, or perhaps the simple unwillingness to confront what was too disturbing to acknowledge, these were the reasons no one stopped it. It was easier to look away, to pretend the family was invisible than to carry the burden of what that truth demanded. So the family endured, decade after decade, their story hiding in plain sight. A community complicit in its silence, a bloodline spiraling ever deeper into itself. And in that silence, new generations continued to emerge, proof that sometimes the most unsettling horrors are the ones people choose not to see. As the decades passed, the family we now speak of grew both in number and in secrecy. Their surname became a kind of unspoken code, a marker that locals would instantly recognize but rarely dare to discuss aloud. In the dusty archives of county courthouses, their records are scattered, incomplete, sometimes intentionally left blank. Birth certificates naming fathers who were cousins, uncles who were brothers-in-law, mothers who were nieces. The truth was buried beneath paperwork that told only fragments, as though even the clerks who signed the forms were too uneasy to preserve the full story. Neighbors remembered the family not for their openness, but for their silence. They rarely mingled at church gatherings, rarely appeared at town events. Their land, tucked deep into the forest, was a boundary most would not cross. Children were warned to stay away, told stories that blurred the line between folklore and reality, stories of strange voices, unsettling appearances, and a family that seemed different in ways no one wanted to explain. Outsiders who stumbled upon their homestead often described a feeling of unease, as though they had stepped into a place untouched by time, where the air itself carried secrets too heavy to breathe. But beneath the silence, life continued as it always had. Cousins married cousins, generation after generation. Some bore children who seemed healthy enough at first glance, while others carried obvious reminders of their shared blood. Crooked teeth, sloping foreheads, sunken chests, and eyes that never quite aligned. These features became not just anomalies but family traits, passed down like heirlooms no one asked to inherit. Yet there is something even more haunting than the physical resemblance. It is the way these children carried themselves, their gazes lingering too long, their words slower, their movements sometimes stiff, as if their bodies were struggling under the weight of histories written into their very bones. To see them was to witness living proof of what happens when the walls of a family close too tightly, when the circle draws so small it can no longer let in fresh air. And still, the family grew. Even as the outside world advanced, new highways, new industries, new technology, this bloodline remained fixed in its own rhythm, untouched and unbroken. A cycle that should have ended long ago, yet continued unyielding, as if bound by forces stronger than choice. For those who looked closely, it raised a chilling question. Was this family still clinging to its own survival, or had survival become a curse they could not escape? To understand how a family becomes trapped in such a cycle, you must first understand the land itself. Appalachia is a place of breathtaking beauty, but behind the rolling hills and dense forests lies isolation so profound that generations can live and die without stepping far beyond the same valley. Roads are few, strangers are unwelcome, and what happens inside those homes often stays there, hidden under layers of silence and pride. For many of these families, the nearest town feels like a foreign land, and the nearest hospital might as well be a world away. In such places, kinship is not only common, it becomes survival. But survival can twist into something darker. When poverty collides with remoteness, and when suspicion of outsiders grows into hostility, a family begins to look inward for connection. Cousins become not just relatives, but potential partners. It may begin with a marriage or two, choices made quietly, behind closed doors. But with every generation, the bloodline folds in on itself a little more, and soon, the faces begin to tell the story without a single word being spoken. Whispers of these families are not new. Old county records, faded photographs, and hushed conversations with aging locals reveal the same patterns again and again. They'll lower their voices when asked, glancing toward the mountains, as if afraid someone, or something, might be listening. They'll say, "You don't want to go there," or "That family's been that way for years." And yet, when pressed, no one denies the truth. They simply turn away, unwilling to bring the shadows into the light. And in those shadows, the children are born, children who carry the weight of generations upon their fragile shoulders. Many suffer from illnesses with no names, their bodies frail, their voices unsteady, their lives marked by the same cycles that created them, yet they are still human, still capable of laughter, still capable of love. That is the cruelest part of all. Behind the deformities, behind the scars of inbreeding, are souls who never chose this path. They are born into a legacy written long before their first breath, and they are condemned to live it. This is where our story begins, not with a single act of defiance, not with one forbidden union, but with a culture of isolation that stretches back over a century. And once you see how it took root, you may never look at forgotten families in the American backwoods the same way again. They say every family carries secrets, but some are so deeply woven into the bloodline that they can no longer be hidden. Imagine walking into a forgotten farmhouse in the hills of Appalachia, where the walls are rotting, the photographs are fading, and yet, behind every frame, there is a face that looks eerily similar. Eyes too close together, jaws misshapen, features echoing one another like mirrors cracked but never broken. What if I told you that those faces are not just the remnants of the past, but are still alive today, still multiplying, still tied to one another by bonds that were never meant to be crossed? This is not the story of a long-dead royal bloodline in Europe, where kings married cousins to protect crowns. No, this is happening here, in America, in towns where strangers rarely step foot, where whispers are louder than truths, and where families build fences not to keep the world out, but to keep the secrets in. It is a lineage that refuses to die out, not because of choice alone, but because of isolation, tradition, and the crushing weight of bloodlines that never stretched far enough. You see, when cousins marry cousins, the very foundation of life begins to unravel. The children born of these unions carry the heavy shadow of their ancestry, trapped in bodies that reveal what the family desperately tries to hide. And in certain corners of this country, where outsiders are regarded with suspicion and kinship is valued more than health, these patterns are not just rumors. They are living, breathing proof of what happens when a family tree curls inward on itself. Tonight we descend into one of those stories, a family whose name is known only in whispers, whose faces cannot be mistaken for anyone else's, and whose story is not one of love or legacy, but survival through repetition. These are the most inbred cousins still breeding today, carrying a family history written not in books, but in blood. The question is not just how this began, but why it continues, and what we uncover may leave you with a truth so unsettling you'll wonder why no one ever dared to tell it before.